Our top focus on Beyond at this hour, a reward or a bounty of $30,000 has been announced by the Iranian army chief for anyone in Iran who captures and kills a U.S. service member attacking Iranian territory. Well, according to the Iranian state-linked reports, Army Commander-in-Chief Major General Amir Hatami said the reward would be funded through public contributions. This announcement comes at a time when the standoff between Washington and Tehran has seen repeated rounds of attacks and confrontations. But the announcement comes with an important distinction. There has been no full-scale U.S. ground invasion or occupation of Iran. And this latest development comes amid U.S. President Donald Trump claiming that he would soon declare the Strait of Hormuz as part of the United States. Well, Tehran has hit back sharply at the U.S. president, stating that the blockaded strait will remain Iranian, while adding that the Strait of Hormuz will only be closed and opened under Iran's command. However, an unnamed White House official quoted by the Wall Street Journal clarified that Trump has been joking. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has allegedly criticized Iran for its excessive spending. Rubio claimed that Iran could have been a very different country had its government invested its resources in its own people instead of supporting armed groups and developing weapons. The ongoing war in West Asia has instead been completely reliant on long-range air power, missiles, drones, and naval operations. The U.S. forces have carried out extensive air and missile strikes against Iranian military infrastructure, including air defense systems, radar sites, missile and drone facilities, and other strategic targets. Iran has responded by targeting U.S. bases across West Asia. At sea, Washington has also maintained a naval blockade around Iranian ports and stepped up operations around the Strait of Hormuz, which is a critical route for global oil and gas shipments. Iranian forces, meanwhile, have targeted U.S. military assets and regional bases, while also threatening or attacking maritime traffic. Almost 6 months into the war, the confrontation remains primarily an air and sea campaign, rather than a conventional ground invasion. There have been maritime confrontations and operations involving Iranian coastal and naval capabilities, but no confirmed U.S. ground force has entered Iran to establish an occupation. Meanwhile, Iran has demanded Qatar to release 3 of its pilots whose aircraft went down during the first couple of weeks of the West Asia war and were captured alive by the Qatari forces. In a letter addressed to the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Iranian armed forces alleged that the pilots have not been allowed to meet or contact their families. Qatar, in response, has hit back at the allegations. The country's foreign ministry has categorically denied the claims. They also added that they are surprised by these misleading statements. They also said that they have carried out their duties to the fullest while searching for the pilots. The announcement of the new bounty thereby raises the stakes in an already volatile conflict, while highlighting the very different nature of the Iran-US confrontation, which is intense aerial and maritime warfare, but no full-scale American ground invasion of Iranian territory. And to discuss this in greater detail, joining us from Wicklow Island is Scott Lucas. He is a professor of international politics, Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Professor Lucas, thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast. Now, I'm curious to know, how are you reading into this bounty that Iran has said that they're going to give $30,000 for anybody who's able to kill U.S. Service officers, and they say that the bounty would be doubled if it's a woman. What does that tell you about the nature of the conflict, according to Tehran, in this scenario?
Well, I think this is a bit of domestic propaganda. As you noted, we're not looking at a U.S. ground invasion inside Iran. Now, there may be U.S. covert operations going on, but Iran has put out statements like this in the past when it's felt threatened by other countries and put out the rewards. And it's primarily not in the expectation that you're going to have an invasion, but just telling the public, support us, keep supporting us. We're fighting this valiant defense, and we're ready if the invaders come.
Of course, Professor Lucas, and on the other hand, we're also seeing growing concerns about the mental health issues of the U.S. personnel, especially on the USS Abraham Lincoln. That also tells us something about, how the U.S. and Iran, they perhaps did not anticipate that the conversation and, the conflict is going to be prolonged for so long. Do you think that is also something which is manifesting in, the reports that we're seeing come out from there?
I think, just to bring all your excellent points together, we're in a state of limbo, almost 6 months after U.S. Israel launched this war. And the reason why we have this limbo is that the Americans have actually rejected expanding military operations. And that's not just rejecting sending in ground troops. 2 weeks ago at an important meeting of Donald Trump's highest level officials, the military said, look, if you want to expand airstrikes in Iran, we don't have enough air defense interceptors to protect against Iranian retaliation. We're facing a shortage of offensive missiles. And as you've just pointed out there, you now have ships that have been in the Gulf, like the USS Abraham Lincoln, since January, with increasing ill effects amongst the crew. That military consideration, combined with the fact that if you expand or go back to the war, that you're going to have further economic shocks just before an American election, and that more than 70% of Americans oppose this war now, I think that means the military option is gone for the Americans. But when I say there's a limbo, the option that is there is getting back into negotiations. And at this point, the Americans don't want to go back into negotiations because they don't want to accept Iran's management, even alongside Oman, of the Strait of Hormuz. And so we're really stuck until I think the Trump administration decides reluctantly that it does have to go back to the table. But if it does so, does it do so on the basis of the memorandum of understanding that Donald Trump signed in June? Or do they just rip that up and say we have to go back to square one on all issues?
Of course, Professor Lucas, and the other big development worth analyzing is Iran saying that it has reached an agreement with Oman on the shipping route map for the Strait of Hormuz. And it says that it is nominal on the commercial traffic. It will only resume once U.S. military withdraws. And it honors the agreement and the pointers in the memorandum. But what are the chances of that happening? Because we've understood that Iran is not backing down. And U.S. has not shown any willingness to make any concessions here.
Well, first, before we get there, we need to have Oman confirming that it has reached the agreement. And even if you've agreed on the routes into and out of the strait, you still have issues. For example, are you going to charge tolls or fees? Who is going to be responsible on it for the day-to-day administration of the strait? Which other states might be involved, including the Gulf states? So we're still not there yet. But let's assume this agreement is reached. The Americans really have two options. One is to try to reject the agreement and say we're going to continue to ignore Iran holding the Strait of Hormuz. But then the effect here is that hundreds of tankers are still trapped in that waterway. You still have that effect on oil and gas and commodity markets, and you'll probably upset a number of states who want the straits reopened. So the alternative is that the Trump administration has to negotiate on the basis of that Iran-Oman management, which was in the memorandum of understanding. I think that's where we eventually land. But again, the frustration here is that we've been kind of stuck for weeks waiting for that moment to arrive. And I still don't think the American administration split. Vice President J.D. Vance wants the war to stop. But I think others in the administration aren't willing to go back into direct talks with Iran yet.
Right, Professor Lucas, and of course this conflict has many aspects and there's a lot more to unpack, and I would request you to stay with us on the broadcast while we also shift focus to another significant move which has come to tighten controls over contact with foreign institutions. Iran's parliament has approved a legislation which criminalizes any communication with foreign media outlets which are considered hostile to the country. While the bill, which would need the Guardian Council's review before becoming a law, it would see any interaction, including participation in discussions which could result in jail terms, ranging from 6 months to 2 years. Interviews with other foreign media would require informing Intelligence Ministry. While any contact with foreign embassies or other institutions without intimation and permission of foreign ministry could result in fines and curtailment of social rights. Now, it's important to note that this is not the first time that Iran has introduced such stringent legislation. Even in 2025, a law was passed after the 12-day conflict with Israel, which imposed tougher penalties for alleged cooperation with hostile states. The new legislation assumes greater significance in light of the recent sentencing of acclaimed photojournalist Yalda Moussairi, who was convicted of colluding with hostile states during her coverage of 12-day conflict last year, when she had shared images with U.S. media and even appeared for interviews on U.S. channels. Now, she had claimed that the IRGC intelligence wing had raided her residence during the anti-regime protests in January this year and seized her phone, laptop and other electronic equipment. And to discuss this in greater detail, we have with us Professor Scott Lucas. Now, Professor, I'm just curious to know, how are you reading into this new directive that has surfaced? Because this is a significant move where they have tightened controls over contact with foreign institutions. What do you think are going to be the implications of this move?
Ever since 2009, when you had the disputed presidential election and Iran had mass protest, anytime you have those protests or you have, as you do now, a war, Iran's hardliners have used that as the reason to have more and more of a security state. The military have much more of a role in Iranian politics than they used to have. You have political prisoners who are swept up almost on a daily basis. Some of them, I have to disclose, are my friends. You have protesters who face those security forces, including back in January when thousands of them were killed when the security forces used a military-style protest. During this U.S.-Israel war, Iran has used that to execute around 30 people who were involved in those protests, and others have been executed for other reasons. And every time this happens, whether you have a war or mass protest, Iran's parliament passes this type of legislation which says, don't speak with outlets that we call the West. Don't cooperate with outlets that we call the West. And we're not talking about cooperating with Western intelligence services. We're talking about having contacts with Western media, with Western lawyers, with Western students, with Western academics like myself. It's an attempt to control and almost shut down Iranian society, because here's a fundamental. If we ever do get a lasting ceasefire, and I sure hope we do, Iran goes back to the pre-war situation where you had widespread protest over economic and political conditions, and the regime does not feel secure about that. While the war is going on, it can tell the public, you have to keep supporting us, you have to keep backing us. But if the war ever stops, how do they get the support of their population? And if the population doesn't support them, how do they control them?
Absolutely. Those are all fair points, Professor Lucas. Thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast and sharing your perspective with us and our viewers.
Thank you.